Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring just desserts. Farewell Message by David Mason. Wreck off Triton by Alfred Coppel. Murderer's Chain by Wenzell Brown. The Deadly Ones by F. L. Wallace. The Man Who Found Out by Roger Dee. Farewell Message by David Mason, originally published in Science Fiction Adventures, April 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. There was the alien spaceship. It squatted in the middle of the airfield's main runway, in the way of every plane landing and taking off, to the complete confusion of traffic control. The airport people had asked Vagu politely to move it. He had looked at them with blank indifference and gone on making notes on Terran marriage rights. Nobody had suggested forcing Vagu to move his ship. The ship looked as heavy as a battle cruiser. It probably was armed, and it did not look as if it could be moved by anything short of a hydrogen bomb. Vagu, when told about hydrogen bombs, had smiled and implied that such weapons were about on par with stone axes. The governments of the world treated Vagu with respect and informed their peoples that he was merely a visiting student, with no intention of harming them, and should be given every courtesy, according to the best traditions of hospitality to strangers. So far, he had not become angry at anyone. It was not too difficult to be courteous to Vagu. He looked reasonably pleasant, the standard number of arms and legs, 1 head, and only a slight tint of green to the skin. The green tint had caused one restaurant in the southern United States some debate before they would permit him a table. But Vagu had not been angered. He had merely smiled and noted it down in his notes about taboos. In fact, the only thing that made it slightly difficult to be courteous to Vagu was his air of superiority. He paid for services and sample objects and information by trading strange gadgets which could do fabulous things, and which were immediately patentable by the lucky owners. But he passed out the priceless gadgets with the air of a civilized man handing out glass beads and useless gimcracks to savages. It was a question how long before someone felt enough insulted by this air of superiority to lose his temper and kill the alien being. The governments of the world were nervously protective of Vagu, trying to postpone and prevent any such murder. They were afraid of a space fleet or police force that might come to inquire what had happened to him, if he came to harm. At last, to the relief of governments and to the joy of the traffic control department of the airport where his ship still obstructed traffic, Vagu was about to go home. His ship was filled with photographs, notes, and souvenirs. He announced that he had spent enough years in a tour of strange planets to complete his course of study. He announced a farewell speech. Photographers brought cameras to focus on him standing on the lowered gangplank of his ship, and color TV projected his image to the screens of the world. A tallish person, only a little strange and ugly, with a smooth greenish tint to his skin. The photographers finished flashing stills, and the TV sound booms moved in to pick up his voice. The oldest reporter there was named McCann, and experience had made him leathery and cynical. He already knew what Vagoo would say. The alien's superior attitude had made it only too clear. Someone reminded Vagoo respectfully that he had promised a speech. "Yes, indeed," he replied sonorously. His English was perfect. He had spent all of 3 hours in learning to speak it. "You may write in your history books that I think Earth is a pleasant little planet," he went on, "but sadly backward and primitive in many respects. I believe that this is caused by the numerous wars and the generally quarrelsome behaviour of your species." He said this without anger, and looked at the crowd and the cameras with a kind of superior pity and compassion in his gaze. "If you could only stop this bickering among yourselves, with a planet as green and pleasant as this, you could attain a harmony and pleasure of life equal to any of the truly civilized worlds of the galaxy. My home world, for example, abolished wars generations ago. We learned the philosophy of cooperation." He paused and gestured up dramatically at the starry night sky, and again looked at the crowd with contempt. "Yes, there are many worlds out there which are peaceful, productive, and cooperative. But there are also worlds which are dead and shrunken cinders, where there had been green planets and thriving races of people who could not give up war. For your sake, I hope that you will be able to change your path, but I think that you do not have the ability, and that at last you will reach the end of the path you are on, and destroy each other, and perhaps your world also. Each nova that you see in the sky marks the suicide of a race. Our knowledge of these matters is certain. There is never a nova caused simply by accident. Power sources cannot fail this way. Each nova tells us of a war, of the death of a culture which probably thought of itself as civilized, and yet could not subdue its innate savagery." The reporters scribbled, and the cameras whirred. McCann closed his notepad, bored, and gazed at the sky, prepared to suffer through the rest of the speech. His paper could get the words of the speech from the TV. McCann had no comment to add. He had heard such ideas before. To the east in the sky was a distant glare of the landing lights of an oncoming aircraft. No, not a plane, a star. A star almost fantastically brilliant, brighter than the others, brighter than Mars. "Mr. Vagoo," a young reporter said excitedly, "isn't that a nova there?" He pointed, and everyone looked. Vagoo turned, his hand on the gangway rail. They waited and fidgeted as he stood without moving, looking up. After a time long enough for him to have memorized the entire star region, his eyes came down again, and he looked at them blankly, as if he had forgotten why they were there. McCann felt a sudden electric thrill of recognition. He had seen a similar paralyzed lack of expression on the faces of men who had just learned that they had made some terrible mistake. He turned abruptly and pushed through the crowd, heading for a phone. The other reporters didn't understand. Not yet. "This nova," one of them said. "What was it from?" Vagoo looked up at it. "A sun blew up," he muttered. 5 years ago. The light took 5 years to get here." The microphones barely picked up his voice. "Do you know anything about the people who lived there, Mr. Vagoo?" Vagoo opened his mouth as if to answer. Then he closed it again. He looked over his shoulder into his spaceship's entrance. A reporter asked, "What about the nova, Mr. Vagoo?" I was very well acquainted with the people who caused it, Vergou said slowly. Very well acquainted. I cannot imagine why it happened. It was a war, wasn't it, Mr. Vergou? A war? Vergou looked up again and hesitated. Yes, I suppose it was. A moment later he added, apparently without reason, I've been away from home a long time. How long will it take you to get back home, Mr. Vergou? Get back? Vergou looked around vaguely. His shoulders slumped. He looked less alien somehow, and more like the men around him, and more likeable. He looked back to his questioner. Oh, yes, I've changed my mind. You may tell your papers that I've, decided to extend my stay with you for some time, I think. The youngest reporter asked suddenly, Did the Nova have anything to do with you changing your mind? With this decision, I mean? The tall, greenish man in the odd clothes came down the gangplank and entered the crowd, peering about him as if he had forgotten the microphones and the cameras he was supposed to be speaking to. Then he saw his object and went through the crowd to him. It was an airfield official. Sir, said Vergou to the official, humbly, and suddenly everyone watching knew how well Vergou had known the people of the Nova world. Sir, I believe this spaceship is on your way. Where would you like me to park it? The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Wreck off Triton by Alfred Coppel. Originally published in Planet Stories, November 1951. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Ron Carnarvon had been the skipper of the late Thunderbird, and it was common knowledge in every port of the EMV Triangle that he had scuttled her. There was a price on his head, and the High Space Guard was combing the space lanes for him, and for the Thunderbird. For the Thunderbird was a treasure ship. But Carnarvon was a cautious man, and no fool. For all that he had committed barratry, he left the Thunderbird in a Trojan orbit 1,000,000 miles off Triton, ruptured and spilling corpses into space. He took a spaceboat and jetted sunward to the Holcomb Foundation outpost on Oberon. Then he stowed away on the mail ship to Canalopolis, still carrying the chart that showed the Thunderbird's position. In the Canal City, Carnarvon evaded the lax guard cordons and found himself a renegade Martian hypnosurgeon to change his face and fingerprints. From then on, it was easy. Across Syrtis Major by Sandski to Marsport posing as a prospector, and from Marsport down the Grand Canal to the Spaceman's Boneyard at Yaki. It was there that he met and hired Pop Wills and the Carefree. Ron Carnarvon acted with characteristic caution when he chose Pop and the Carefree to do the ghoul work on the ship he had murdered. Pop's ship was a rusty bucket, but well enough fixed to reach Triton where the Thunderbird's corpse orbited, her vault heavy with plutonian sapphires. And Pop needed work badly. He was almost too broke to outfit his ship for the flight. Carnarvon noted with curling lip that most of Pop's acids had long ago been liquidated to buy gin. The long years in space had taken a toll on the old man. Actually a greater toll than even Carnarvon could have imagined. Pop and the Carefree fitted in with Carnarvon's plans to perfection. Pop had been in trouble more than once with the High Space Guard. Pop was an old soak who wouldn't be missed, Then something happened to the Carefree. The rest of the beached Rex and Yaki would only shake their heads and agree that Pop had pushed the old bucket a few G's too hard somewhere. That was just the end the wrecker had in mind for Pop when his job was finished too. It was only reasonable. He couldn't let Pop live to tell the guard that Ron Carnarvon had had a hypnosurgical metamorphosis. Even a fortune in sapphires couldn't buy the high space guard. It was far too well heeled with Holcomb Foundation money, and it took its duties to the inhabitants of the Earth-Mars-Venus triangle seriously. A cautious man would realize this, and take the proper steps. In this case, the proper steps would be the elimination of Pop Wills when his job was done. But everyone makes mistakes. Carnarvon made one when he selected Pop and the Carefree. With all the rusty hulks dotting the ramps of Yaki, and with all the even rustier skippers there, he should have hired someone else. Anyone else. Ron Carnarvon should have connected Pop Wills with a 12-year-old cabin boy of the Thunderbird. The youngster's name had been Wills too, but of course Carnarvon couldn't have been expected to remember everything. Just coincidence, but those things do happen. So these two lifted from Mars together, a captain who had wrecked his own ship, and a gin-soaked old man whose only son had died because of it, and neither knew the other for what he was. To Carnarvon, Pop was just a fall guy doing his job in proper sucker fashion, and to Pop Wills, Carnarvon was just John Smith, who wanted to go to grid M332254-89OK off Triton, and was willing to pay well for the privilege. The wrecker ordered the course, and Pop set it. Mars began to dwindle, and the belt loomed up ahead. The Carefree threaded her way through the rocky maze and on, past Saturn and Uranus in a free-falling arc. She was slow, but in space, slow is a relative term. The outer planets were in triple conjunction, and with their help, the old boat made time. Carnarvon checked the course daily, and Pop accepted the corrections without protest. After all, John Smith was paying for the trip, and he seemed to know what he was doing. No questions asked. Carnarvon liked that. No questions, no trouble. He couldn't have been more wrong. It's hard to say in mere words what old Pop must have felt when he picked up the wreck of the Thunderbird on the radar. He recognized the image, of course. The Thunderbird was unique among spaces. Then he checked her position against the chart that Carnarvon had marked, and realized why they had come. He realized, too, who this John Smith was, and hate pulsed through him in sickening waves. Pop wasn't a brave man, and he was past his prime, but he could still hate. Almost without conscious thought, Pop broke out the ultrawave and began calling the guard. He broadcast full particulars, coordinates, descriptions, everything. He was at it when Carnarvon found him and sent him crashing against the control panels with a smashing overhand right to the mouth. Pop sprawled on the metal decking and watched the wrecker carefully smash every communicating device on the ship's panel. There was a throbbing pain in his head where he had struck the shabbily padded control console, and the thick taste of blood was in his bruised mouth. He watched Carnarvon like an animal, a hurt, impotently raging beast, and he began to be afraid. Even his hate couldn't spare him for that, for Pop was afraid to die, and he knew just what his chances were now. Carnarvon, on the other hand, didn't waste time hating. He didn't know why Pop had called Copper, and he didn't really care. Pop wasn't important. The sapphires in the Thunderbird's vault, they were important. He'd come too far to abandon them now. It would take 9 minutes for Pop's radio appeal to reach the nearest guard base, Carnarvon calculated, and it would take 6 hours for the fastest guard ship to reach them after that. He could board the Thunderbird and loot her in not more than 2 hours. That would still give the Carefree a 4-hour start on the guard, and in deep space 4 hours were as good as 4,000. Carnarvon still wasn't worried. The wrecking of the Thunderbird had been the work of months, and he wasn't going to panic now. Ron Carnarvon wasn't that sort of a criminal. Blaster in hand, he motioned Pop to his feet. He wondered vaguely just why the old man had taken such a chance. He couldn't have any notions of collecting the reward for Carnarvon. The amount was less than the amount he was getting for doing this. Carnarvon smiled bleakly. Salvage job. And the old man was a coward. He could see it in the trembling of the blue-veined hands, in the shifting faintness of the watery blue eyes. The wrecker shrugged aside the thoughts as unimportant, and set to work. With the blaster in his ribs, Pop Wills did as he was told. He braked the Carefree to a stop 20 miles from the ruptured hulk of the liner. There were beads of sweat standing out on Pop's forehead, and his hands shook on the firing console. A thin trickle of dark blood marred his stubbled chin. His battered lips were unsteady. For a few bad moments, Pop Wills thought Carnarvon was going to blast him as soon as the Carefree lost way, but then even his gin-soaked mind began to understand that the end wasn't quite yet. Carnarvon needed help looting the murdered liner. If he was going to lay his hands on her valuables before the guard appeared, he'd have to get Pop working with him. Maybe if Pop had been more of a man, he could have stopped the wrecker cold right there. But long years of boozing had left Pop weak. He could hate well enough, but fear conquers even hate. And that blaster that followed him in every movement made Pops's thin blood run cold. Life, even a life like Pop Wills's, was better than the black void of death. Pop was ready to buy a few more minutes of life at almost any price, even from the man who had killed his boy. The old man was like a rusty watch spring, battered and wound to the utmost limit, and jammed there, frozen by the reality of that ugly blaster and the cold eyes behind it. Pop would help Carnarvon. He couldn't help himself, and his hate expanded to include his own senile weakness. The Thunderbird spun slowly in the light of the faraway sun, the rent in her hull gaping like a mouthful of jagged teeth. She had been a beautiful thing once, but she was ugly now in death. She had not died gracefully. Her back had been broken and her innards scattered. She orbited sullenly, and around her spun the broken fragments of her inner body, the bloated, frozen corpses of the men she'd carried. Against the backdrop of the stars and the blaze of the Milky Way, she seemed to be a blot on the heavens. Pop Wills and Ron Carnarvon watched her, each of them with his own thoughts. Then the wrecker motioned toward the suit lockers with his blaster. It took a bit of doing to get into his own pressure suit and still keep the blaster pointed at Wills, but Carnarvon was a large man and supple, and he managed it well enough. The Carefree had no escape boat, so there was nothing for it but to rely on the suit motors to take them across to the Thunderbird. It promised to be slow going, for the suit motors were weak and produced only 1/10 G of thrust. Almost anything thrown out ahead by a man in a spacesuit was enough to stop him cold. The recoil overcame the suit motor with ridiculous ease, and though the motor labored mightily, it would take a long while to re-establish the original direction of movement. But Carnarvon had an answer for that, too. A quick check of the radar showed that there were still no guard ships within hailing distance. Carnarvon's original estimate of the time it would take the space guard to arrive on the scene turned out to be surprisingly accurate. He connected his suit to Pop's with a short cable and snap hooks, and together they made their way to the Carefree's dorsal valve. Carnarvon had no intention of sweating out a long, slow crossing to the hulk, so he ran the lock pressure up high and waited until the outer hatch was lined up with the derelict liner. Then, with a sudden movement, he spun the wheel and popped the outer portal. Pop and Carnarvon shot into space like grotesque bowlers. The Thunderbird loomed up ahead. Pop kept his mouth shut and his eyes open. He saw more than an old man might be expected to see, too. For instance, he saw that Carnarvon, cautious though he might be, had neglected to take an extra magazine for his blaster. That meant that there were just 3 shots in the weapon, one of which Pop figured would be used against the vault of the scuttled liner. Not that the old man was making any plans. He was still too weighted by his fear and his sense of impotence for that. He merely noticed and prayed to the gods of space that one of those shots in the blaster might not be meant for him. As they drew near the liner, Pop felt nausea churning his stomach. The ship was surrounded by satellites, space-bloated bodies, naked and misshapen in the bitter light of the dim sun that reflected off the pitted flanks of the burst vessel. Spread-eagled grotesquely, the corpses circled their ship, puffy things of horror with staring eyes and extended fingers. Other things, too, circled the hulk. Small commonplace items, a clock, a chair, shattered crockery, tiny inconsequential things, all mutely accusing, all muttering silently that their ship had been betrayed by someone who should have protected her. Pop glanced over at Carnarvon. Through the steel-glass bubble of his helmet he could see the wrecker's face. There was no expression on it other than concentration and greed. Pop knew about greed. He'd lived with greed and degradation a lot in his past few years. He hated Carnarvon even more now for having reminded him, but he was still too sick with futility to do more than tell himself that he had done all he could do. He had called the guard, after all, and then, for an awful moment, he found himself regretting that he had done even that, and thereby lost all hope for life. Their magnetic shoes touched the Thunderbird's hull with a sound faintly carried through the air in their suits. They stood on the curving surface, etched in black against the starry sky. A few feet away from them, the Terminator was inching toward them as the derelict rotated slowly. With Carnarvon leading the way, they clumped heavily to the ripped and tortured hull plates where the Thunderbird had been sundered. By the light of their helmet lights, Pop could see the thoroughness of the wrecker's work. He had been her captain, this Carnarvon, and he had known just how to murder her. The outer hull was a shambles, and the pressure hull holed in 3 places. It had been a thorough job. Only one prepared for the sudden horror of her death could have survived it. Pop Wills thought of his boy and sobbed. The dark companionways were empty, blown clean by the violence of the Thunderbird's death. Ron Carnarvon led the way down into the ship, to the purser's office and the vault. Rubble cluttered the small room, bulkheads bent awry, and pipes and wires littered the deck. Carnarvon turned Pop loose and set him to work cleaning out a path to the vault. Pop's breath was coming in shuddering, grating gasps when he finished the work a half-hour later. Carnarvon nodded approvingly and motioned him away from the vault. Pop watched while the wrecker braced himself and took careful aim at the vault's lock mechanism with the blaster. There was a searing flash of blue flame, and red sparks showered as the oxyhydrogen bolt sliced into the steel of the door. Pop found himself praying fervently that it would take 2 more shots. Carnarvon fired again, and the tiny room blazed. Pop muttered shakily under his breath, and waiting for the wrecker to blast just once more. The lock surrendered in a trickle of white-hot slag, and Pop felt himself sink low. There was still that one shot left for him, and he wasn't needed now. The door swung open, and Carnarvon knelt to rifle the vault. When he at last straightened, he held a pool of jagged blue fire in his gloved hands. The gems sparkled with a life of their own, 24 faceted beauties, each worth a king's ransom, and each bought with a man's life. Presently they stood again on the outer hull, under an unreal canopy of stars. Nearby, a ghastly satellite was swinging inward toward the ship. Pop stared at it, and back to Carnarvon. He began to understand what the wrecker planned. He was going to leave him here, on the wreck, and he would die here. He understood that the shot that remained in the blaster wasn't for him after all. Carnarvon wasn't going to waste it on him. There was a spanner in the wrecker's hand, and he now advanced purposefully toward Pop Wills. Pop stepped backwards, retreating from the heavy figure of the wrecker. Fear was surging in waves through him, fear mixed with blind hate and contempt for himself and his senile weakness. Overhead, against the stars, the awful satellite drew nearer. Carnarvon reduced the power in his magnetic shoes and moved lightly toward Pop, the spanner raised to strike. The old man stumbled against a long shard of steel on the hull that floated upward at his touch. Fear paralyzed him, and he stood now, waiting for the blow of the spanner that would smash his helmet and leave him a distended corpse spinning through space. Above him, the satellite spun inward. Pop glanced up, into the agonized, dead face of a 12-year-old boy. He shrieked. The sound deafened him in the bubble of his helmet. All the fear and weakness turned to a bitter hate and surged forward in one insane motion toward his tormentor. The long shard of steel came to hand like a lance. The rusted, warped old watch spring that was Pop Wills recoiled and unwound in one raging moment. He charged Carnarvon. Carnarvon evaded the clumsy charge instinctively. With an almost unconscious motion, he raised the blaster and fired point blank. The searing bolt caught Pop Wills in the chest and spun him around. Tattered ribbons of charred flesh and melted metal from his suit intermingled. He curled inward upon himself in an awkward, graceless fashion, and sank to the hull plates, a nimbus of ice flowing from the gap in his suit as the water vapour and blood spurted into the vacuum. But there was something strangely like a smile on his face as life left him. Pop had conquered his fear at last. But Carnarvon, on the other end of the bolt of fire that had ended Pop Wills's life, spun outward, away from the Thunderbird, away from the carefree, end over end, driven by the fiery recoil of his own weapon. At a speed considerably less than the muzzle velocity of the blast, but still much higher than the best speed of the feeble suit motor, Ron Carnarvon spun into space. Out and away, the precious sapphires spilling out of his hand, glittering in the faint sunlight as they took up their orbits about him, like tiny mocking moonlets. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. Murderer's Chain by Wenzell Brown. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, March 1960. Narrated by Tom Trussel. If Maudie had only given me the $10,000 to invest in the Martian Development Company, there would have been no reason to kill her. The money would have been more than tripled, and my financial troubles would have been over. But Maudie has always been so unreasonable. Even though she grudgingly admitted that I had been right in the Martian venture, she still had no faith in my business judgment. She was as adamant as ever about parting with the smallest fraction of her vast fortune when I had the opportunity to step in on the ground floor of the Balsavia 6 Mining Corporation. Balsavia 6, in case you don't know, is the newest planet which Earth's spaceships have touched. Everything about Balsavias has been kept strictly hush-hush. Only a handful of people have the slightest concept of the value of the new planet's mineral deposits. It just happened that one of the men in on the top secret was my friend Sylvester, and he was willing to cut me in on a slice of the corporation he was forming for as little as $5,000 on the line. The problem was how to get my hands on that much folding stuff. The answer should have been easy. Maudie, Mrs. Maud Terrain, was one of Earth's wealthiest women, and after all, Maudie was my mother-in-law. The trouble with Maudie was that she was narrow-minded, prejudiced, I might say bigoted. She liked to boast that her family have come from good solid earth stock from the beginning of time, and, while she mingled with the social elite from Venus, she considered Martians crude and refused to entertain guests from what she described as the minor planets. Maudie's second trouble was that she was mean. Although her daughter Isabel and I have been married for 8 years, Maudie never did more than to provide us with a modest allowance. She always felt that I should work, which, after all, is pretty nonsensical when there are so many ways for a man with a little capital to get rich quick. Isabel isn't like Maudie. She's easygoing, pliant, susceptible to flattery, and, on Maudie's death, Isabel would inherit her full fortune. So with a deal like this in the offing, it didn't take any great brain to see that Maudie's rapid demise would remove the single obstacle that stood between myself and untold wealth. The thought of killing Maudie had come often to my mind since my talk with Sylvester, but the available weapons all seemed too crude. I'm a fastidious person, and the idea of shooting or stabbing Maudie was just too vulgar. One of the more subtle poisons might have turned a trick, but certainly nothing as obvious as cyanide or arsenic. As for curare or Bellaston, to be frank, I hadn't the foggiest notion where to lay my hands on them. That's the way things stood when I just happened to stop in front of the window of Melvin Rose's house of fantastic jewellery in Greenwich Village. I'd passed by the shop many times, but I'd never paused to look in. Of recent years, the village had filled up with all sorts of peculiar people, Martians, Venusians, and the little green men from outer space. One thing I'll have to hand to Maudie. She was right about calling some of these people uncouth. Some of the Galaxians really are riff-raff. Out in front of the store were some long pink flyers advertising the jewellery within. I picked one up idly, for it had just occurred to me that Maudie's birthday was the next day, and that it might not be a bad idea to soften her up with a gift. I looked at the monstrous chunks of jewellery in the display window, rings, bracelets, whatnots, decorated with staring eyes, floating amoebas, and gilded kidneys. Maudie was a pushover for spectacular accoutrements, but this stuff exceeded even her flamboyant taste. Probably I would have walked on by if a couple of lines at the top of the flyer hadn't caught my attention. They were written by some old-time humorist called S.J. Perelman, and he described the jewellery as being like an egg balanced on a cone, an erg balanced on a bone, a hag balanced on a roan. That last part seemed a perfect description of Maudie, a hag balanced on a roan. Almost by instinct I started to climb the crooked stone steps to the shop. The door was open, and the proprietor was standing behind the counter. Other than that, the place was empty. I'd seen Melvin Rosy around before. He was a big brute of a man with a shaggy red beard who sported a dangling jade earring in his left ear. I'd always suspected that Rosy had Martian blood, but I'd never been sure until I glimpsed the little purple flecks in the lines of his palms that are a dead giveaway. Rosy looked up, and his gaze seemed to go right through me. Some of these Martian chaps have an uncanny skill at reading your mind. Rosy's voice was clear and soft, but it had the timbre of some stringed instrument. He said, "A gift, perhaps, for a woman?" I nodded, but I almost jumped out of my skin when he added, "For your mother-in-law, I should imagine. I'm sure I have just the thing." He showed me a half-dozen pendants and bracelets, but I could see his heart wasn't in it. He was sizing me up, wanting to make sure of me before he offered the pièce de résistance. I could feel excitement surging up inside me, even though I had no notion of what it would bring forth. Finally, he went to the rear of the shop and disappeared behind a batik curtain. When he returned, he held in his hand a heart-shaped box of deep napped velvet, royal purple in colour. He laid the box on the glass counter, but his wide palm nearly covered it. His eyes held mine, and his thick lips quirked in a smile that was almost a grimace. He said, "I take it you want an extra special gift. I might say a gift for the departing, even a fatal gift." I gulped and nodded. He raised the box and slipped the catch. The lid rose slowly on coiled hinges, and I was staring at the most delicately wrought necklace I had ever seen. It was long and thin, no wider than a shoestring, and the clasp was a beautifully constructed replica of a snake's head. I looked at the intricate design of the narrow chain with wonder. Certainly it was not a product of Earth, I thought. Nowhere on this planet do we have craftsmen capable of such elaboration of minutiae. Even more striking than the workmanship on the chain was its coloration. It was not gold, as I had first thought, but a metal unknown to me with a flame-like orange glow. My gaze was drawn away from the necklace by Rosy's soft chuckle. "It is magnificent, is it not?" "Yes," I said, "but far beyond my means. I had in mind some trifle." Rosy lifted a hand for silence, and again I noticed the purple flecks in the palm. He said, "Nothing is too expensive for the woman you hate." I began to stutter a protest, but something in Rosy's expression stopped me. He spoke gently, as though humouring a child. "We do not need to discuss price. The necklace will make you a wealthy man. We can settle upon terms then." "I don't understand." "Ah, but you will," he said, smiling. "You do not recognize the metal. There is nothing strange about that. Probably no man of Earth have ever seen it and lived. In Mars it has been given the name of malutrex, and even here it is both rare and extremely expensive because of its peculiar properties. In all, I doubt if more than a dozen such necklaces were made up. They are called," he stopped to underscore his point, "murderers' chains." I think he expected me to ask why, but for some reason my throat was so dry that I couldn't trust myself to speak. "You will recall," he continued slowly, "that way back in the 20th century, when the Martians first came to Earth, they were not made exactly welcome. Our first spaceships were fired upon, and many of our people were killed. Our next step was secret infiltration. We landed our ships in deserts and other isolated spots and unloaded select groups to intermingle with the Earth people, and, because we are a superior race, soon many of our representatives held important posts among the governments of the Earth, especially that of the United States. To these Martians fell the task of breaking down ancient prejudices so that Earth could be opened to unrestricted trade and immigration. This was not easy. The men of Earth still remained hostile to us, and, when we were unmasked as Martians, many of us were imprisoned, and some were beaten to death, even executed. The people of Earth were, as a whole, complacent, but they were whipped up to a frenzy by scaremongers and demagogues whose voices it became necessary to silence. Open retaliation would have done more harm than good, and it was then that the Martians found the perfect weapon: malotrex. This is a metal quite harmless to Martians, for, as you know, our blood has a quite different composition than yours. We can handle malotrex without the slightest danger. Look." He reached down, coiled the slender chain about his wrist, caught the hook in the tongue-like catch for the delicate clasp, then unloosened it again. He smiled and was silent for a minute, studying my face. When he spoke again, it was with slow deliberation. "Maybe you remember hearing tales long ago of the silent death. Certain isolationist congressmen and senators who spearheaded the opposition to interplanetary development died mysteriously and without visible cause. Malotrex was the cause of their deaths." I was culling out half-forgotten bits of information that I had learned as a schoolboy. "But how—" Again the purple-flecked palm raised to interrupt me. "Earthmen are hot-blooded. The chemical analysis of their bodies— but I won't bother you with the technicalities. In plain language, once a chain of malotrex circles human flesh, it begins to shrink, slowly, almost invisibly. It grows tighter and tighter until it becomes a strangler's noose, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that the Earthman can do about it. Once the clasp is fastened, no matter how he tries, he cannot undo it, nor, after a few minutes, can he loosen the chain from his skin. In most cases, the victim is taken completely unaware by the death creeping upon him. Malotrex constricts gradually and painlessly, except for the last spluttering moment of life." My knees felt a little weak, and my stomach queasy. Why tell me? Why should you let me in on this secret? Rosie's smile became more intimate. "Mrs. Terrain is not exactly popular among Martians," he said softly. "If I remember correctly, she is the chairman of the League to Oppose Interplanetary Marriage, and has financed the Earth Citizens Council, to name only a few of the discriminatory organizations with which she has linked herself. Perhaps you, as her heir, could put her fortune to a better use." "There's no doubt of that," I said. "Well then." "But I've no desire to be dissolved in the death-ray chamber for murder." "Nor is there any need to do so. Look, was a single one of our assassins caught, but the necklace would be found embedded in her flesh. He shook his head. Perhaps I've not made the situation clear. The pumping of the heart, the warmth of the blood, cause malutrex to contract. As soon as death sets in, the necklace resumes its normal proportions. The clasp can be unfastened, the necklace removed, and as long as the ends do not meet, it remains completely harmless. I gulped again. Murder in the abstract is one thing. Planned, cold-blooded murder is something else again. But Maudie dead, and all that money in my hands. Suddenly I laughed as I saw where my thoughts were leading me. The whole thing was a hoax of some kind. As before, Rosie seemed to read my mind. He reached for my wrist and twisted the necklace about it. I stared at the delicate change in fascination. As I watched, I could see the metal shrink, barely perceptibly, but certainly for all that. I clawed at the clasp and tried to unfasten it. It was utterly hopeless, and swift panic swept over me. I grasped the slender chain and tried to wrench it free. It was tougher than finely tempered steel. Sweat popped out on my forehead, and I could hardly repress a scream. With a knowing nod of his head, Rosie leaned forward and lifted my wrist. He opened the catch with a lazy flick of his fingers. I was breathing hard and scared half out of my wits, but I was caught in the trap that Rosie had set for me. Maudie dead, myself a millionaire, and no chance of being caught. This was too good to pass up. I knew it, and so did Rosie. All we had to do was agree on terms. Half an hour later, when I left the House of Fantastic Jewelry, the royal purple box with the murderer's chain lay in my pocket, beautifully gift-wrapped. I had to lay my plans carefully, but unwittingly. Maudie and Isabel conspired to make it easy. A dinner had been arranged at Maudie's apartment as a birthday celebration. The only other guests would be Sylvester and his wife. Maudie had been complaining of bad headaches of late, and never liked to go out after dinner, but she had purchased 4 tickets for the most popular play of the season, The Fairest of Ladies, and insisted that the 4 of us should see it. She would rest while we were gone, but would keep her light on so that Isabel could come in to kiss her good night. Everything went like clockwork. I bought a little gift for Maudie and presented it to her early in the evening. The dinner was very gay, and just as we were about to leave, I announced that I had another gift. Maudie was delighted with the chain. I didn't even have to fasten it around her neck as I had planned. She snapped the clasp herself and went to the mirror in the foyer, preening and admiring herself, and the necklace that winked and glittered in the light. I was the last one out of the door, and Maudie clung to me for a minute, drawing my head down to kiss me. Maybe she'd softened up enough to lend me a few thousand, I thought. But even if she had, it was too late. I couldn't very well snatch the necklace back, even if it were possible to release it from about her throat. I don't remember much about the play. I was thinking of Maudie all the time, and I was torn between all sorts of doubts and fears. One minute I'd be way down in the dumps, and the next I'd be floating up in the clouds, planning all the good times Isabel and I could have with Maudie's millions. In my mind, I'd see a picture of Maudie lying dead, and then I'd decide that Rosie had conned me, and Maudie would be as spry as ever when we got home. Sometimes I'd want it one way, and sometimes the other. I was really mixed up and on edge. The play seemed to last for about 10 light years, but actually it wasn't quite midnight when we caught a taxi outside the theatre. As soon as we rounded the corner and were in sight of the marquee of the apartment house, I knew something had gone wrong. 2 red and white police cars blocked off the entrance of the house, and a curious throng of people had gathered around. I'd expected to have a chance to retrieve the necklace before the police were called. In the confusion of discovering her body, no one would notice, or, even if someone did, it wouldn't appear particularly odd for me to unfasten the necklace and slip it in my pocket. After all, it would have been my last gift to her. With the police already on the scene, that part of the plan was out. Nothing was left except to play it by ear. We pushed our way through the curious idlers and the neighbours who'd come out into the halls. A cop was at the front door, but as soon as we'd identified ourselves, he ushered us into Maudie's big front room. Only 2 cops were there. I didn't get the smaller one's name, but the towering man in plain clothes introduced himself as Lieutenant Onset of Central Homicide. Just the mention of homicide was enough to give me the jitters bad, but fortunately Isabel stole the scene with a fit of hysterics that nearly blew the roof off the place. She distracted everyone with her screaming jag, long enough for me to slip into the bedroom for a look at Maudie. She lay straight on the bed, her arms flung out, her face contorted and blue, but not a mark on her throat. What I wanted most was to get my hands on the necklace, but when I drew close to her, I could see that it was gone. I stood still, breathing hard, trying to collect my wits. Could the necklace have slipped off after death? I scanned the bedclothes, the carpet beside the bed, the medicine table. No sign of it. I hadn't heard anyone enter the room, but when I looked up, I found myself staring into the pale grey eyes of Lieutenant Onset. His face wore an official mask of blankness, but it was belied by the quirk of his lips. He knew something, I thought, or at least he was suspicious. I had to take a firm grip on myself not to make a break for it, and try to rush past him to the freedom of the hall. Onset motioned me back to the front room. Isabel had quieted down, although she was still sobbing. Sylvester and his wife were sitting on the divan holding hands and looking distraught. I went to Isabel and slid my arms around her and waited to see what would come next. The questioning was all very polite, in perfect order. The details of the birthday dinner and the theatre party came out. We learned in turn that a friend of Maudie's, who had a key to the apartment, had dropped in to surprise her with a birthday gift and had discovered the body. There was some mention of the necklace, but neither Onset nor his partner pursued the matter. I was beginning to feel cocky again, sure that Maudie's death would be put down to accidental strangulation or a heart attack. In about an hour, we were all told that we could leave, but just as we got to the door, Onset called me back and asked me to wait. Sylvester offered to take Isabel home, and I didn't dare to protest too much. I stood in the middle of the room, listening to their footsteps die away in the hall, and then I turned to face Onset. His partner had disappeared, and the 2 of us were alone in the room. He sat down in an easy chair and crossed his legs. There wasn't anything for me to do but try to appear as much at ease as he. We sat there in silence for long minutes. Finally, Onset dug out a cigarette and offered me one. I took it and lit up. The smoke burned my throat, but having something to do with my hands helped. I was scared, but I reckoned that the best thing to do was put on a show of indignation. "What is this?" I blustered. "I've told you everything I know." He gave a thin smile. "I don't think so, Mr. Duff." "I don't care what you think. I've nothing more to say." He snuffed out his cigarette very carefully in one of Maudie's little mosaic ashtrays, and slowly his hand dipped into his pocket. When it came out, the necklace dangled from his fingers. I could feel my heart lurch, but I still tried to bluff it out, complaining about being separated from Isabel. On set didn't say a word, just dangled the chain so that the light from the lamp rippled along its slender surface. In a few minutes I ran out of words. On set gave a deep sigh and rose from his chair. "Do you want to tell me about this little gift to your mother-in-law?" I clamped my lips shut. "I'm through. Finished. I'll not say another word." The quirk of his lips reminded me of Melvin Rosey. He raised the chain over my head, and the next thing I knew it was about my throat. My fingers scrabbled for it, but I couldn't pry it loose. I gave up and stared at Onset in stunned silence. His hands were still outstretched, and as I looked up at them, I could see the tiny purple flecks in his palms. I couldn't believe it, not at first. Whoever heard of a Martian making the New York police force? But when he spoke, his voice had dropped its growl. It was soft and musical, a Martian voice. He said, "I think you're going to tell me everything I want to know. You'll write it all down, too." Like I said before, it's really uncanny the way some of these Martian chaps can read your mind. He was right, straight down the line. I told him everything. I wrote it all down and didn't waste any time about it because every second the necklace was growing smaller and smaller. When I finished, I signed it and pushed it over to him. Here it is.
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
The Deadly Ones by F.L. Wallace. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, July 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Rathston. I'm sure the name means nothing to you. There are legends, of course, from old Germany and the Greater Reich, colonial America even, but you can't prove anything very damaging or concrete with legends. And even when the story is otherwise correct, I've been careful to keep my name out of it. A clever person shuns publicity, though it may involve tampering with history. For all practical purposes, the name Rathston is unknown. I want it kept that way. I can't remember when the inspiration came. Probably it had lain for a long time dormant in the back of my mind, like a mole hibernating in midwinter. Warmed by the proper circumstances, it emerged at last in its full vigour to claim my attention. I've always worked hard, but lately what I got out of my efforts you couldn't call a living. The Red Cross was largely responsible. You could never get me to say a good word for that agency. Never. Still, I have made use of them, and in this case they made their contribution, though it was an unwitting one. I gave the idea careful thought. From the beginning I knew I needed help. I'm not superhuman, not in the strict sense, though I suppose I could give a good account of myself against Wells's Invisible Man, Homo Superior, or the new crop of mutants that will spring up some day soon. I needed help, and I carried the problem to a council of my fellows. We discussed it thoroughly, and in the end Though they didn't give me their blessing, they consented to aid me. The problem was flying saucers, or rather, how to force one to land. We debated the matter for a long time, but there didn't seem to be any way to do it. No jet could keep up with a saucer, and present rockets were equally inadequate. Besides, we didn't have access to any of these machines. Someone in the back of the council, whose name I didn't catch, suggested that, if we couldn't force one to land, perhaps we could lure one down. It didn't matter how, as long as it remained on the ground for an hour or so, with its ports open. The rest would be up to me. "Fine," I said. "What do you propose?" "They're investigating, you know," he said, "in the western part of the country. Rocket bases, atom bomb sites, anything that indicates advanced technology. Let's give them another menace." "Sounds good. What are they interested in?" He was a hard fellow to locate, and I didn't try to visualize his face. He came from Ireland, I believe. "A spaceship," he said. "A very formidable creation, with an incredible drive." There was nothing wrong with the basic concept. The ship wouldn't be real, of course. It would merely seem real from the air. We could accomplish that. As for the drive, we could manage that too. In a little investigated part of the spectrum, we could create a low and steady output, suggesting that the drive was idling, ready for instant takeoff. None of this was impossible for us. We? Have I said that we're not human? We've existed for a long time on Earth beside Homo sapiens, and he has only dimly guessed that we are here. The ordinary limitations of men don't apply to us. A few of us working together could create an illusionary spaceship, and an intriguing drive to go with it. This was something flying saucers couldn't resist. They'd come down where they found they couldn't investigate from the customary high-level flights. I nodded at the fellow I couldn't see. "Excellent. However, when the saucer lands, you'll have to maintain the illusion. Logistics are involved too." "That's easy," he said. "But what if it isn't manned by robots, as you've assumed? You can get inside all right, but a living creature will discover you." I looked at the blank spot where I thought he might be. "Really now, it has to be a robot. No living creature, except us, can stand the accelerations we've observed." "But what if we're wrong?" he persisted. "In that case, we'll have time for one quick look," I said. "If it is living and we're no match for it, we'll run like hell." There was general laughter, and the fellow raised no further objections. For all I know, he went home. The meeting broke up, and everyone except a few volunteers left. We continued to discuss ways and means. When the plans seemed foolproof, I got up. "Just a minute," another fellow I didn't recognize interposed. "Suppose everything works the way you say it will. The saucer lands, and you succeed in getting inside. What makes you think it'll go back to the home planet?" "Don't overlook our fake spaceship," I said. "If the robot investigator from the saucer found a real spaceship, that would be important information. It would be important enough to warrant a quick trip back to the local base, wherever that may be situated. But when the robot can't locate anything, in spite of the evidence on the instruments, it will be dealing with top priority stuff. Logically, it will have to report back to the Prime Evaluation Center on the home planet. I think I'm safe in anticipating a short journey." "I hope so." He shook his head dubiously. "But what about us? We don't have to worry about humans, and probably those things out there haven't come close enough to learn about us. But they're pretty advanced. What if they should?" "You think they can detect us when we're dematerialized?" I smiled. "Don't be naive. Anyway, nothing risked, you know." I shouldn't have said that. I talk too much. "Nothing gained," he completed the sentence for me. He didn't look altruistic. "Just what do we stand to gain?" The others hadn't thought of it, and neither had I, from that angle. I ad-libbed. "It's not been good here lately. There's too many factors against us, agencies that I don't have to mention. Feast or famine, mostly the last. And what are we going to do after an atomic war when mutants come along? Are you sure we can compete with them? As bad as it is now, it can get worse." I paused to let the dire predictions sink in. "Someone has to do it, and I intend to be the one to find new worlds for us," I said. My confidence impressed the others, but not the heckler. "I can see that you'll find it for yourself, but how are you going to let us know?" "Just now, I can't communicate from here to Philadelphia," I said. "It's a harassing business, merely trying to stay alive. Here, I haven't had time to practice mental communication. But there, conditions will be ideal, and I expect to develop myself so that I can reach out anywhere in the galaxy." Objectively, that was true. Subjectively, I could have changed my mind about sharing my prize. They didn't think of that, and I didn't mention it. The last objection was silenced. They went about their preparations, and I about mine. We set up the decoy in Illinois. No real reason, I suppose, except that most of us are allergic to desert. The logical place to build spaceport and ships. Deserts are hot, dry, and bright, and there are few humans there. In our own way, we're fond of men, though they may not think so. Illinois it was, and if there was a note of incongruity in it, so much the better. A spaceship looked strange in the middle of the flat cornfields. Very well, it did. Let the robot investigator find out why it was there. The creation was not difficult. There was a haze in the air, and the fields were green, and the spaceship pointed a sleek nose toward the sky. It was impalpable from below. A farmer ploughed right through the stern tubes without knowing they were there. An inconvenience only. We blacked him out as seen from above. The farmhouse we converted into a control tower, and the barn became a disembarkation structure. There were side manifestations, of course. Dogs growled uneasily and barked, then ran away and hid in the woods. Roosters could not crow, nor hens lay eggs. Milk curdled in cows and cans, and all the butter turned rancid. Unfortunately, we don't often use our entire minds, and when we do, there are peripheral effects. However, no human in the area noticed us, and life went on pretty much as usual. Radio reception was poor over all North America, and television was disrupted for 1,000 miles. The disruption was deliberately planned. We had to attract the attention of the sources, and that was the easiest way to do it. The radiation was supposed to represent a power leak from a hypothetical interstellar drive. They came the second night, and it was good they did. The strain was telling on everyone in the project. It's not easy to keep up such big illusion. The flight of saucers wheeled across the sky, lights out and undoubtedly ready for action. They had located us all right, and they wanted to see just what it was we had. But they couldn't find out from the air, no matter how many times they passed over. It must have been quite a jolt. They had Earth all pegged down to the last improvement in a self-locking nut, and suddenly here was something new which didn't belong. Toward midnight, with 5 of them still skimming the clouds, the 6th came down. I was ready, and had everything I needed with me. The saucer landed in a field a half-mile away. The vegetation burned invisibly where it settled. A section of the saucer opened, and a much littler saucer came out. The little saucer was a robot. I was sure of that the instant I saw it, mostly because it had wheels. There is nothing to indicate that a life form can't have wheels, but it does pose a nice problem for what a living creature will use for bearings. It was a robot then, and it came out and headed for our ship, which was still holding together splendidly, needle nose aimed at the sky. It was time for me to go to work. I started toward the big saucer. "It's coming closer!" This was the thought of the individual who had created the ship out of his own dematerialized atoms. "Put out a force field and keep it away." He sounded shaky, and I thought a wry jest would help. The containers I was carrying were heavy. The ship snorted. "I wish I could, but seriously, how long do I have to stay here?" "Keep it up," I said. "I've got lots of supplies." The terror in his voice was real. "I don't like that thing. It's snooping around." "Waken the farmer. Maybe he'll kick up a disturbance and the robot will investigate." With a shotgun, the farmer couldn't do much, but a lucky shot might put a wheel out of commission. The robot wouldn't like that. "I can't make the farmer open his eyes. The saucer put him to sleep and I can't touch his mind." The saucers had a good brand of hypnotism, if that's what it was. We knew they had space travel, and now it was evident that they were equally advanced in other ways. "Use your judgment," I told the ship. "Hold it as long as you can, and then pretend to go out into space, or forward in time. Anything that will look good." I needed time. I could have dematerialized where I stood, and rematerialized inside the saucer. But if I did, I would have to leave most of my supplies behind. A short journey, I had said. And that was true. Short as far as interstellar distances were concerned. But it would be long by normal methods of reckoning, and I had to live through it. I couldn't abandon my supplies. I succeeded in transponding all the food to a place just outside the large saucer before our ship disappeared. It didn't go out into space, nor into time as I expected. Instead, it sank rapidly into the ground and left no hole behind. This, I think, confused the robot. I heard it thrashing around in the cornfield, possibly in bewilderment. I gathered some of the containers and carried them inside the saucer. It was lighted all right, and the lighting scheme was as weird as the interior. They used the spectrum below the red and above the violet. Why this should be so, I don't know. I merely report what I found. Apparently they didn't react to what we consider visible light. I adjusted my eyes. I found an empty space, which I assumed was for the storage of specimens. I put my food in there. Outside, I went for more, and then back again. I repeated my trips until everything was loaded. Unpalatable food, of course, concentrated and not tasty, but it would last until I stepped out on the planet at the opposite end. After that, there would be other problems. I went outside for the last communication with my fellows. The ship I could examine later. I looked around. The control tower and disembarkation structure were still visible, though they were wavering in the dim light. "Are you there?" I thought. "I am," the control tower thought back. "I wish I wasn't." "It's just a robot," I said reassuringly. "It's not interested in a building." "Maybe not," conceded the control tower. "But it's inside, examining sleeping people. I wish it would go away." He was losing control of himself, and that didn't suit my purpose. "It's just a machine. Hold on for a little longer." He held on. The robot left the illusionary control tower and headed toward the saucer. For a squat, ungainly contrivance, it covered the distance in an amazing fashion. I had barely time to get inside before it rumbled into the saucer. It was carrying something. We took off before I could see what it was. We left Earth smoothly, though any kind of takeoff would have suited me. Inertia had never been my problem. Neither was the possibility that the robot would discover me. I was certain I didn't register on light-sensitive cells, and I had other tricks I could use if I had to. The robot had tentacles I hadn't noticed before because they had been retracted. They weren't retracted now, and they held a farmer. He was unconscious. The robot was monkeying around with the farmer, but it was hardly the time to interfere. Needles stabbed the farmer in several places, withdrawing the blood and storing it, probably inside the robot. The first needles were jerked out and replaced by others. Again, this was logical. Pumping a fluid into the farmer's veins with the intent of suspending the life force until they reached the home planet. The whole procedure made sense. When the robot couldn't find the spaceship, it had taken someone in the vicinity for questioning. They'd be surprised what they'd learn from the farmer, though. Absolutely nothing. We had protected ourselves too well. The farmer's ordeal had no bearing on the success of my enterprise. Nevertheless, I became slightly ill at the waste involved. The robot dropped the farmer in a place similar to the one in which I had hidden my supplies. Then it crouched down and became motionless, waiting. There was nothing for it to do. Nor for myself either. We were out of the atmosphere and on our way. The journey was 6 months of monotony. Avoiding the robot was easy, because it didn't move. The ship was all mine, but I couldn't make use of it. I puttered around, but there was nothing much to learn. The drive was in operation, and as long as it was, I couldn't get close. I had no idea of what it was, nor how it worked, but the force that surrounded it was, for me at least, an absolute barrier. The rest of the saucer was equally confounding. There were several low-ceilinged compartments which held instruments at whose function I could not guess. There were no star charts anywhere, but I had to assume the ship knew where it was going. Whatever our destination, we were approaching it faster than light. Occasionally I looked out of the vision ports, and what I saw didn't resemble suns, though of course they were. It was the light shaft which changed their appearance. One day the saucer gave a lurch, and we were simultaneously below the speed of light and near our goal. Dead ahead was a multiple star system. Where it lay with relation to Earth, I don't know. Within 50 to 1,000 light-years, I suppose. For the first time in months, the robot stirred, went to the farmer, and began to work on him. I kept out of the way. It seemed the sensible thing to do. No matter how often I looked, I couldn't determine the location of the planet toward which we were bound. The ship knew, but I was in ignorance. From behind, in the next compartment, came the laboured sounds of the robot. Then there was another sound, and it didn't come from the robot. I looked in. The farmer sat up, gazed around, understood some or little of what he saw. That understanding was enough for him. He collapsed. He was still breathing, though, in spasmodic gasps. The revivification was a complete success. I decided to keep the man in mind. He was an important source of reserve strength. My hopes leapt high when I saw the planet. It was something less than the size of Saturn, but much larger than Earth. It was large enough to support a tremendous population. I hadn't bargained for anything so good. I had only a vague plan to go by. I had made the journey in complete safety, and that was most important. My next move would depend on circumstances. I could dematerialize myself off the ship and onto the planet. With an extreme expenditure of energy, I could even take the remainder of my food supply with me. But it didn't seem worth the effort. I had done all right so far by remaining quiet and letting events occur as they would. I decided to see it through on the same basis. I stayed in the ship and let it land. That was not my first mistake, landing with the ship. If anything, the error began 1,000 years earlier, in my infancy, the first night I saw the light of the moon. No one asked me to come. I did it voluntarily, for reasons my total personality found acceptable. In my own mind, I added up the advantages in leaving Earth, and then schemed until I found a way to do it. I had been dissatisfied with the way things were going among men. I objected to blood spilled uselessly. And so I had contrived an escape. Greener pastures? Not exactly. I don't like salads. Still, the saying conveys something of the way I felt. Long before the ship landed, it was too late, though I didn't know it. The robot scurried about the saucer, chirruping mechanically and creaking. When it finished the duties, it picked up the farmer and carried him out. The man was still unconscious, but he began to scream. Soon after it left, other robots came into the ship. Slightly different from the kind I had seen, they must have been repair robots. They went about tasks that were unfamiliar to me, and they talked. This was new. I couldn't understand what they said until I found the speech center of one and let my mind reach out lightly. "A master says there is a stowaway on one of the ships." It was unforeseen. Nothing I had encountered could detect my existence without registering on my consciousness. These masters were going to be tougher than humans. I waited while the other replied. "Do they know what ship he's on?" My robot waved a tentacle. "There are 10,000 ships here, each waiting for a checkover before reassignment. Would they bother to search each ship?" "Physically, you mean?" asked the other. "No, they will take him off as the ship leaves." Getting me off was going to take some doing, though the masters didn't know it. They may have gauged humans correctly, but they hadn't met me. Nevertheless, I was uneasy. "Why does he stay on the ship?" asked my robot. The other chuckled. "Maybe he's changed his mind and wants to go home. He'll be surprised when he learns where he's bound for." I'll admit I panicked then, because a robot chuckled. It's not the friendly sound you might think. And also because of what it said. I had no intention of going home, but I liked to think I could if I wanted to. Now I saw that, due to their system of rotating assignments, it was next to impossible to determine which ship was going back to Earth. I made up my mind quickly. Several things happened simultaneously. I dematerialized myself where I was, and rematerialized tenuously inside the robot. At the same time, I took control of its motor and brain centers. I forced it away from the job, and commanded it to go to the storage space where the last of my food was hidden. The other robot didn't notice. I surmised they didn't take orders from each other, but from someone above. For the moment, I was above. Out of the ship we went, and into the confusion of the repair shops. Nothing but ships and robots, and I had enough of these. I needed a hiding place to rest, and plan my forays against the creatures of this planet. I rummaged hurriedly through the robot brain and learned that we were near the edge of a large city. Without cataloguing all the information I received, I forced the robot through obscure alleys toward the open plain that surrounded the city. It was cramped and uncomfortable inside the robot, even though I didn't exist as solid matter. And I had to operate blind. I couldn't adjust my sight to that of the robot, and had to function once removed from reality, through its incomplete senses. The last alley we entered ended on the open plain. The robot rolled down it, and stopped. I couldn't see what was in front of us, but I could guess. One of the creatures of the planet, the things that made the flying saucers. Without hesitation, I directed the robot to attack. It didn't. Its refusal was not unexpected. They would have been quite insane to build robots without installing some safeguards. It meant, however, that the next step was up to me. I took it. I dematerialized out of the robot and rematerialized facing my antagonist. On the average, it takes me a few microseconds to evaluate a foe and find his weakness. I looked longer than that. It was the first time I had seen anything that could destroy at a glance my confidence in my own survival capacity. And there was no weakness. What I did then was not cowardice. It was pure survival, the reaction of a nervous system shocked to the limits of endurance. I dematerialized myself from where I stood and rematerialized far out on the open plain. Twice I repeated the process until the city was out of sight over the horizon. The creature didn't follow, though it could have done so easily enough, if it had wanted to. I know my strength. On Earth, it's the source of legends, the shadowy, half-believed stories of werewolves and vampires. Fact and fancy mixed together to chill the minds and hearts of men. For myself, and others like me, it's a distinct advantage to have our existence doubted. A victim paralyzed with fear, too shocked and demoralized to cry out, is easier to subdue. But the strength I was so confident of is meaningless here. Crouched in the shadow of the boulder, the only shade on the arid plain, it suddenly dawned on me that the creatures who ruled this planet knew about me from the beginning, when I thought I was hidden. It amused them, I think. I can't go back to the city and find the farmer. He's their meat. And I have limitations. I can't dematerialize myself off this planet. A few drops of fluid are left in the container with the Red Cross stamp on it, my last link with Earth. I was born knowing the facts of my life. For 1,000 years I've taken my food where and how I could get it. But these creatures are different, not only in body chemistry. They have tougher than Teflon skin, and have hydrofluoric acids in their veins. I've always killed for food, but they kill for pleasure. And their appearance exactly coincides with their character. I ought to know. But there's one escape they forgot about, and I will take it. When they come hunting, they won't find me. Self-destruction is preferable to meeting those horrors face to face again.
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
The Man Who Found Out by Roger Dee, writing as Roger Dee. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, September 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The trouble with Fortuné was that he was not merely a skeptic, but a professional skeptic, which is just another way of saying that he was a widely known and highly paid journalist who had long ago learned to capitalize on his penchant for iconoclasm. Fortuné was also given to the sort of reflexive arrogance inevitable to some small men, and was unscrupulous enough in his exercise to point up the flavour of his satiric commentary on any currently newsworthy phenomenon with a strong spice of semantic misrepresentation. Fortuné was, in short, an able, intelligent, ambitious, and thoroughly offensive little heel. He was precisely the sort who should never have been permitted in any reasonable capacity aboard a scientific vessel like the oceanographic survey tug Cormorant, when she was in the process of investigating a find as important as a gigantic artifact which Dr. Hans Weygand had discovered in the 6-mile abyss of Bartlett Deep just south of Cuba. But Fortuné's publisher was a power among politicians as well as among publishers, so Fortuné was able to announce in his syndicated column that his readers would receive on-the-spot coverage of the investigation, and that no smokescreen of scientific double-talk should keep the truth from them. The announcement was greeted with great interest, since various disturbing rumours concerning the nature of Dr. Weigand's discovery were already in circulation. Most of them, since Dr. Weigand himself was frankly unable to offer any clue as to their origin or purpose, were elaborated upon by Fortuné and his colleagues with less regard for truth than for dramatic effect. As a consequence, the newspaper-reading public was torn between a number of equally improbable theories which supposed that Dr. Weigand's find was not an artifact at all, but a monstrous bubble of molten basalt blown up ages before by a subterranean volcano and frozen solid by contact with seawater. A patent impossibility, since the thing occurred in an area free of any early volcanism, and was, by accurate sonar measurement, a sharply defined oblong body some 6 miles long, 3 miles wide, and 2 miles high. It was an artifact of recent construction, being nothing less than an undersea Russian submarine base built secretly during the Korean diversion and designed to obliterate the Americas under a rain of hydrogen bombs. It was a colossal structure erected by the inhabitants of an antediluvian country like Atlantis, and inundated by the waters of some prehistoric flood. It was, despite Plato's insistence that any mythical land lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Atlantis herself. It was neither of these, but a self-sufficient city built by a naturally marine race of men who had taken a divergent line of evolution and who might, for all anyone knew, be plotting a war of conquest against the honest, industrious, amicable, and God-fearing nations of topside humanity. None of these, Fortuné pontificated, was likely. Only one fact could be accounted certain, he added with clarion determination, and that Fortuné himself, armed with the invincible power of the press, would find out. And Fortuné did, because Fortuné never let his readers down. By luck, the journalist boarded the cormorant just in time to keep his promise, for the tug's straining winch was in the process of swinging from her deck the quartz-glass bathysphere which Dr. Weigand had designed for plumbing the Bartlett Deep. Fortuné's appearance was a source of instant consternation to Dr. Weigand's staff, who had been at their business long enough to know public relations trouble when they saw it. Promptly they shifted the problem of Fortuné's disposition upward through the chain of seniority to Dr. Weigand himself. The old oceanographer, in answer to their frantic calls over his bathysphere telephone, unscrewed the circular hatch of his quartz-glass ball and put out his head much after the fashion of a bearded and bifurcled bear peering from his winter den. He made a desperate attempt to close the hatch when he recognized Fortuné, but Fortuné was not to be denied. "Hold everything," said Fortuné, in effect. "I am here, in the interests of God and country and 20 million newspaper readers, to investigate this investigation." Dr. Weigand protested the interruption of his work, and Fortuné invoked the power of the press. Worse, he threatened the good doctor with the personal wrath of Fortuné. His logic was wonderfully cogent. Dr. Weigand's project depended largely upon government subsidy, and Congress controlled such subsidies. The people controlled Congress, and Fortuné controlled public opinion. "I'll have them screaming for your head on a pike," Fortuné swore. And Dr. Weigand, who had lived long enough to understand that Fortuné could do just that, reluctantly surrendered. Fortuné was a tyrannical little heel, but he possessed a certain amount of physical courage. "I'm going down with you, Wiggy," he said, "and see this lost world shanty for myself." And Fortuné went down, because he was confident that he would come up again. Their descent into Bartlett Deep would have been enthralling to Dr. Weigand without Fortenay's company, and deadly dull to Fortenay without the doctor's. As it developed, Dr. Weigand could only moon like a distracted Bruin on his leather bathysphere seat, and peer miserably out at the marine wonders rising past his eyes, while Fortenay occupied himself with assessing the oceanographer's motives in pursuing an investigation so harebrained. For Fortenay did not believe for a minute that it was an artifact which Dr. Weigand had discovered, but a natural and therefore profitless formation. His suspicions were confirmed when he learned that the bathysphere could descend no more than a mile into the 6-mile basin of Bartlett Deep without being crushed, to borrow a simile from Fortenay's ready stock, like an eggshell under the mounting pressure of water above. Since the thing at the bottom stood only 2 miles in height, it followed by simple subtraction that 3 miles of dark and watery distance must remain between the cameras of the observer and their target. The only possible inference was that Dr. Weigand had built the bathysphere for the sole purpose of titillating popular interest, and so justifying a request for additional funds for his project. "It gets your name in the papers," Fortenay said with caustic irony, "and makes it easier to bilk the taxpayers next time. And if you're forced to admit it's only another volcanic chunk, then your project will still be in the black, won't it?" The unexpected attack, to tap Fortenay's gift for simile again, knocked the oceanographer for a devastating loop. His reasoning had been much as Fortenay guessed, though the difficulty of maintaining a truly important scientific project without government aid had seemed more than enough to justify the trifling subterfuge. The doctor saw his mistake now, and while the bathysphere sank lower and lower into the darkening water, he sought frantically for a loophole of escape from the disaster he foresaw in tomorrow's newspapers. He might have saved himself the effort. Fortenay had already headlined his report, and his only interest now was in the sport of baiting his victim. The exposure of fakes, quacks, mountebanks, and myths, Fortenay declared, was his specialty. He offered copious proof. "There was that pig-tailed brat in Arkansas," Fortenay said, "who claimed she could levitate pianos and start fires by crossing her eyes. The local papers had half the country believing it until I went down and bluffed her into a test demonstration with arc lights and a TV hookup. Maybe you caught that show. The act was a jip, and I showed the world. You never heard from her again, did you?" Dr. Weigand recalled the incident, and thought with some commiseration that the nervous breakdown which followed the neurotic child's exposure to Fortenay's baying attack might have been responsible for the loss of any poltergeist power. "And those 3 jokers in Ohio," enumerated Fortenay, "who claimed they found a dead flying saucer pilot. I bought it from them, and proved it was only a carnival baboon dipped in laundry bluing. I got those jerks 3 years for fraud." "And here am I," thought Dr. Weigand, "an honest man and a respected scientist, about to suffer a punishment even more terrible at the hands of this trumpeting little ferret, because I have sought to keep my project alive. He will shout my little indiscretion from his journalistic housetop, and my reputation and my job will go like fog before the wind. I will be discredited, and my honor will hang her head before the neighbors, and my little Karen and Wilhelmina, who know nothing of it, will be jeered in the schoolyard." "Ach," said the doctor, who seldom said ach. "It should not happen to a dog, not yet even to a hyena. Dowser in Oklahoma, who charged fees to locate water," Fortenay ran on relentlessly. "He got away with that racket until I went out with some geological experts and a cameraman and showed him up. After that, thought Dr. Weigand, the poor fellow's gift was destroyed along with his confidence, and there was nothing." But the doctor's commiseration rang hollow even to himself, for it had occurred to him suddenly that it might not be necessary after all for this thing to happen to him and to Anna and Karen and Wilhelmina. It would mean the end of Hans Weigand, of course, but his project would go on. He would be not a heel, but a hero, and his family would be pensioned instead of pilloried. And what is death to a true scientist when the man must die anyway, but his reputation may live forever? Trouble is that people are so gullible, Fortuné was expounded. He pronounced it gullible, not that it mattered. They'll believe anything they're told as long as it has its roots in some old myth or legend handed down to them. They'll believe it if their fathers believed it, because they're fools. He leaned across the cramped cell of the bathysphere and tapped the doctor on the knee. And do you know why people are fools, Wiggy? Because scientists teach them to be fools. Every superstition that people cling to was handed down from the time when wise men, the scientists of the day, taught it as gospel truth. Scientists are always making some kind of mistake, and the people foot the bill. A few years ago, they made an error in some law about variable stars, a little bobble of 100%, and now they're saying the whole universe is twice as big as they've been teaching. And do you know why scientists make stupid mistakes, and why they change their stories ever so often? Because they're fools too, and thieves into the bargain. Like you, Wiggy. I must do it, Dr. Weigand muttered. Yes, I think certainly it is the only way. Scientists are always starting myths, Fortuné gabbled, never dreaming of what went on behind the doctor's bifocals. Take the legend of Atlantis, for instance. The soft sheen of undersea light, like a pattern of moonbeams filtered through the deepest jade, was lost on him. The deep water cold of Bartlett Deep that crept through the quartz shell of the bathysphere troubled him not at all. When a hairy old Greek named Plato wrote a book about Atlantis, everybody believed him, because he was a scientist, Fortuné went on. He pronounced it Plato. And now you pop up with a story about an undersea artifact. You might as well have come right out and called it a building. And what you're really trying to do is to start another crazy myth about a drowned civilization right here in our own backyard. That's the way these lies start. He might have enlarged further upon this topic if Dr. Weigand had not stood up suddenly, like Samson in the temple, and yanked an innocent-seeming lever that disconnected the bathysphere from its overhead cable and let it drop like a stone toward the bottom of Bartlett Deep. Perhaps we start a little myth of our own, you and I, Dr. Weigand said as the telephone wires ripped loose. Perhaps our friends up there will say to the newspapers that a sea monster came up and ate us, nicht wahr? Fortuné, of course, sprang upon the burly old oceanographer in a frenzy, and of course accomplished nothing. Dr. Weigand took him by the shoulders and replaced him in his leather seat. We can neither of us do anything now, the good doctor said. Sit, Mr. Fortuné, and tell me more about how you do not believe in myths. Fortuné sat, but said nothing, for there was nothing to say. Fortuné sat for a long while and breathed hard through his thin inquisitive nose, while the bathysphere sank down and down into gathering green darkness. After a time, it dawned upon him with a great rush of relief that Fortuné, the columnist, whose facile wit daily entertained 20 millions of people, could not possibly die in any such fantastic fashion. It simply couldn't happen. He was the victim of a peculiarly vivid dream, three-dimensional, complete with technicolor and tactile sensations, but still a dream, from which he must waken shortly. But there was no denying that it was a horribly convincing dream. The monstrous artifact he had come to investigate, it really was a building of some sort, he saw now, and not a ruin at all, rose closer and closer until its vast top spread out on the bathysphere like a mossy green plateau. A random eddy of current caught the bathysphere and pushed it gently outward as it sank, so that it missed the edge and fell on toward the bottom, and the barnacled wall that slid up to tower over Fortuné was as blank and final as the rim of the world. They were approaching the bottom of Bartlett Deep when they saw the first gigantic splashes of lettering, emblazoned like the heraldic script of a Titan across the face of the wall. The doctor was beside himself with the frenzy of his discovery, but could make nothing of it, because the wall was much too near. It was like looking at a billboard from a distance of 6 inches, and so Dr. Hans Weigand passed the last moments of his life, as he had lived the greater part of it, in disappointment and frustration. Fortuné, bemused by his dream, took no such interest. Actually, he felt a little smug that he should have had the acumen to recognize it for what it was, even before he woke, and that he should have been able, even in the grip of a nightmare, to face down a big-time myth-making scientist like Wiggy on his own ground. All this would vanish soon, he told himself, even as the first sudden tracery of strained fissures appeared in the quartz-glass shell of the bathysphere. A dream is a myth, and a myth is a dream, and he would wake up soon. The bathysphere burst, crushed, as Fortuné would have said, like an eggshell. Fortuné woke, not from a dream, but from an existence. He found himself standing on a smooth floor of shell before a vast and featureless building whose facade towered mistily up out of sight. Little eddies of current bore tiny feathery creatures that brushed past and through him, glowing phosphorescently. Glittering fragments of the shattered bathysphere fell like a rain of outsized diamonds about his feet. Dr. Weigand stood beside him, bifocaled eyes speculative, his whiskers comfortably afloat like seaweed in the green water. "I think we go inside when the door opens," the good doctor said. "Inside?" echoed Fortuné. "To what?" "To a myth," said Dr. Weigand. "A myth that was made for such lost ones as you and I." Fortuné saw the legend then. It was far up on the facade, above the doorway, and at such a distance the quaint antique script, like its meaning, was wonderfully and fearfully clear. Davy Jones's locker. The door that opened led downward and outward, companion-wise, to a green and enigmatic beyond. "Let us go, my little friend," said Dr. Weigand. "It is better not to be sent for, I think." And Fortuné went, because he had no choice. The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And don't forget to check out the channel. There's hundreds of stories. Hundreds of stories.